I'm Daniel Hahn, Chief Influential Listener with Impact SAC and founder of A Way Forward. Enjoy this history moment because only by knowing how we got here can we find a way forward. So education has long been utilized to negatively impact various segments of our society. For example, during slavery times, it was illegal often for slaves to learn how to read or write or get any sort of education. But education has been utilized long after slavery was over, long after the Civil War, and for many, many years and decades after the Emancipation Proclamation. For example, during World War II, something called the Double V campaign came about. The Double V campaign was an enormous effort to promote the fight for democracy overseas and also on the home front in the United States by the African American community against laws that were contained in the Jim Crow era. The campaign originated in the largest circulated African American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, on February 7th, 1942. It all started when James Thompson, a 26-year-old African American cafeteria worker in Wichita, Kansas, who worked in a factory that supported the manufacturing of aircraft and military equipment. Mr. Thompson wrote a letter to the newspaper where he posed one question: should we sacrifice, or should I sacrifice my life to live as half American in the United States? He suggested that the black community fight for one victory over our enemies abroad and one victory over the enemies within, such as the Jim Crow laws. The campaign soon was carried by all black newspapers throughout the country and had a 91% approval rate amongst the African American community. It was supported by numerous organizations such as North Carolina A&T State University and the United Automobile Workers. The campaign played a significant role in encouraging the defense industry to hire African American employees who left the South in huge numbers for the North and West Coasts to find jobs that supported the war effort. The campaign promoted patriotism, and support of the war effort grew amongst African Americans due to the Double V campaign. The Double V campaign is seen as helping lay the groundwork for the future civil rights movement. Southern newspapers and journalists criticized the slogan and characterized it as a dangerous revolution, and the government tried to get the black press to cease agitation in an effort for greater rights. Unfortunately, when over 1 million African American GIs returned from the war, they found some of the same discrimination that was here when they left to fight and put their lives on the line for this country. They continued to see the discrimination when it came to jobs, housing, and education. See, in 1944, Congress drafted a GI Bill that provided benefits for veterans returning from the war, benefits such as college tuition, low-cost home loans, and unemployment insurance of about $20 a week. There was no distinction in the law regarding race, but the Southern Democrats were worried that the black veterans would use public sympathy for veterans to advocate against the Jim Crow law. So Congressman John Rankin, a congressman from Mississippi, insisted that the program be administered at the state level as opposed to at the federal level when folks tried to access the benefits of the GI Bill. Rankin defended segregation, opposed interracial marriage, and even proposed legislation to confine, then deport, every person with Japanese heritage during World War II. The returning African American GIs often couldn't access the benefits of the GI Bill for several reasons. Many black vets were dishonorably discharged at a much higher rate than their white counterpart veterans, which disqualified them for benefits. If you were dishonorably discharged, you could not access those benefits. Many were turned away by vocational training solely due to their race. A vocational training program in Indianapolis for plumbing, electricity, and printing turned away black vets because the school said the equipment was only available to white. Northern universities dragged their feet when admitting black students, and Southern universities banned blacks altogether. Many black veterans often didn't apply to college because they couldn't afford not to work. Many black veterans, approximately 95% of them, were encouraged to go to historically black colleges, which were underfunded, overwhelmed with a new influx of students. Black vets were turned away by the tens of thousands. Many were victims of intimidation when it came to housing and trying to access the benefits for housing in the GI Bill. In Chicago, thousands of black veterans were attacked with crowds throwing rocks when they tried to move in to a specific housing development. Unemployment insurance, which was typically about $20 a week, often excluded black veterans as they were doled out inequitably. Many were kicked out of the program if other work was available, even though that other work was much less than adequate pay and much less than unemployment insurance. Home loans were often not available to black veterans because they were not administered by the federal government due to Congressman Rankin, but rather the white-run financial institutions within the individual states. They had free rein to refuse mortgages and loans to black veterans. In 1947, 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities were given out. Only 2 of those went to black homeowners. In New York and northern New Jersey, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill supported home purchases by non-white veterans. Per historian Ira Katzenelson, no greater instrument for widening an already huge racial gap in post-war America than the GI Bill. Many historians state that the GI Bill helped create the middle class in our country due to the assistance with purchasing a home. This means that black families were prevented from entering the middle class due to being locked out of the benefits that other segments of our society enjoyed per the GI Bill. This story of how discrimination, racism, and bias played a significant role in cities throughout our country. It's also a story of how people from different backgrounds and experiences came together. On May 7, 1954, Attorney Thurgood Marshall argued for desegregation in the case Brown versus the Board of Education. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. Yet, 3 years later, in 1957, 9 black students, called the Little Rock Nine, tried to integrate Little Rock Central High School and earn an equal education as the white children in their city were. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus called the National Guard, along with about 1,000 community members, to block those 9 students from entering that school solely because they were black. The students were repeatedly threatened and spit on as they tried to enter the school. A journalist was even hit in the head with a brick. 3 weeks later, the 9 students actually were able to get into the school when President Dwight Eisenhower deployed the 101st Airborne Division and federalized the National Guard to get students into school. But that was just the start for the Little Rock Nine. The 9 students had to keep spare clothes at school due to continually being spit upon and the cafeteria food thrown on them. They were all kept separate except for during lunch, so they would each be isolated at the school. They were continuously called the N-word, kicked and thrown to the ground as they walked the halls. One was beat up in the basement, and one had acid thrown in her face. The students' families faced consequences also. Parents' work dried up. Family would receive threatening phone calls that included people calling from the morgue, asking them if they could come identify a body, insinuating that it was their child. They would receive phone calls threatening to burn their house down, to kill them, and to grind their bones. Minnie Jean Brown Trinke, one of the Little Rock Nine, was suspended when several boys in the cafeteria were kicking and pushing chairs into her legs as she walked with a food tray in the cafeteria. She poured chili on one of those other students' heads. The teacher saw this and asked her if she had did it on purpose. Minnie Jean responded, "I accidentally did it on purpose." She was suspended from school. When Minnie Jean returned to school, a group of girls followed her around for a week, hurling insults and stepping on her heels. One eventually hit her in the back of the head with a purse full of padlocks. Minnie Jean turned around, knocked the bag to the ground, and shouted, "Leave me alone, you white trash." A teacher and the National Guard, who were escorting Minnie Jean for protection to her classes, they claimed they only witnessed the second part. They failed to witness the part with the backpack and the padlocks and the insults. They only witnessed Minnie Jean's retaliation. And as part of that, she was expelled from school in February of 1958. As she was walking from school, she could hear the students say, "One down, 8 to go." Only 3 of the 9 students graduated from Little Rock Central High School, some of which were expelled. 6 years later, after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional, in 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges tried to attend William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans, Louisiana. Ruby was born 3 months and 22 days after the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. The white parents at that school removed their kids from school until a white pastor walked through the mob and walked his 5-year-old daughter into school. All teachers except for one, Miss Barbara Henry, refused to teach Ruby. Every single teacher in the school except for Barbara Henry refused to allow Ruby in their classes. She was the only kid in Miss Henry's class all year. Every day on the way to school, a woman would follow Ruby, 6-year-old Ruby, and threaten to poison her. Another woman would follow her with a black baby doll in a coffin. Her dad lost his job at the gas station. The store the family shopped at refused to sell to them anymore, and her grandparents were turned off their land in Mississippi. Ruby has said that many people, both white and black, supported her family. The neighbors gave her dad a job. They helped babysit, among other things. 9 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, on June 11, 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace personally blocked the door to Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama. He was doing this to prevent the black students, the first black students to ever attend Alabama. He stood in the doorway. That day has come to be known as the stand in the schoolhouse door. Earlier that year, in 1963, Governor Wallace said in his inauguration address, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." He only moved out of the way for those 2 African-American students to attend the University of Alabama when President John F. Kennedy ordered the National Guard to intervene. This is a story of how discrimination, racism, bias has played a significant role in communities throughout our country. It is also a story of how people from different backgrounds and experiences came together to change not only one person's circumstances, but the circumstances of their community, their state, and our country. Thank you for listening, and let's make tomorrow better for everyone.